Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 246, The Wheatfield at Gettysburg. Last episode, we had a high-level view on events in 1862. Having already conducted this exercise for 1861, hopefully it was helpful to see how everything fits together in the second year of the war. This week, we finally head back to Gettysburg. Probably some of you may be saying, what took you so long? But I'm hoping this episode is well worth the wait. We need to revisit a particular part of the battlefield I am most fascinated with that I think we maybe only minorly touched on, that being the Wheatfield. Of course, let's talk about some Patreon content before we really get into the episode here. And since we are doing Gettysburg, we are going to do it all the way through, and Patreon content is going to reflect that. We did some monuments from Gettysburg, just did a little picture slideshow and just talked about them. Some memorable monuments. Not really any rhyme or reason to those, just some pictures that I've taken before and just kind of talked about them a little bit. So if you want to check that out, that sounds like it might be interesting. There is a link in the show description. We have done other similar style of slideshows. We have done movie reviews. We've done memoir reviews. We have another memoir review that's going to be on tap here. 13 Months in the Confederate Army. That is coming up here shortly, right down the pike. So if that sounds like it would interest you, again, those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So when I was a kid in grade school, and I was sick and had to stay home, I had a kind of ritual. Part of that ritual would be to watch a recorded tape of History Channel programs that had been set up for me, which included the first season of Civil War Combat. Now, I want to talk about Civil War Combat perhaps in the future, but essentially this was a show that covered a part of a battle, or maybe a battle as a whole in the Civil War, and it was a mixture of reenactments that were done fairly well, in my opinion, and experts talking about the engagements. Some of the talking heads in these programs are actually sources that I've used in the series as they wrote books, but this is where my connection to the Wheatfield comes from, as in the first season, the subject matters were the Hornet's Nest at Shiloh, the Sunken Road at Antietam, Cold Harbor as a whole, and of course, the Wheatfield. While I am not sure I necessarily had a favorite episode out of these four, I think a good candidate might have been the action at Gettysburg. The Wheatfield was different because it wasn't the main attraction necessarily. Even at the younger age, I think I was a little over focusing on Little Round Top. That seemed to be a little too mainstream to me. Or perhaps Pickett's Charge, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, right? That might be why I'm a little more interested in the first day out of the 3 days now, because I think sometimes it is a little overlooked. Now, part of that is maybe the movie Gettysburg, and of course we talked about that in the Patreon episode, but that movie is based on a book that does highlight several of these areas, and on the second and third day, we kind of have these pivotal points, and we will talk about that and about how Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is really self-promoting in his idea that Little Round Top was the turning point of the battle, and maybe even the war, and maybe even American history. But the fact is, on the second day, we do have Little Round Top, we do have Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, we even have the action at Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill, as we mentioned, but sometimes I think the Wheatfield is kind of overlooked in what happens there. Now, I do think it is kind of important to note that it's sort of part of the jigsaw puzzle that is the Confederate attack on the second day, and so it's connected to some of these other locations. Maybe it is different if the Wheatfield is all the way over where East Cavalry Field is, and it's kind of on its own spot, and not right in the middle of where everything is happening. But also on the flip side of that, it is right in the middle of everything and where everything is happening. It changes hands several times during the fight. Sometimes it is quite confusing as to where troops are and what's going on and what direction they're even facing. Honestly, I think one of the most useful and best battlefield tours I was ever on was one with a registered battlefield guide at Gettysburg, specifically at the Wheatfield, and he was able to really give a good idea of what happened and why monuments are where they are. At minimal, I hope you enjoy this rundown and return to Gettysburg because it's been a while. No matter where we are on the field, no matter what day it is, I think it's good to be back just in general to this nice crossroads town in Pennsylvania. Maybe we just need to hammer home that the Wheatfield is satisfying your major battlefield requirements, that every one of them needs to have a wheat field, a stone wall, an orchard, a cornfield, or a combination of those things. So at minimal, if you're looking to have that aesthetic satisfied, well then here you go. But hopefully we walk away with a better understanding of the action and significance of what happened on July 2nd, 1863. Now, it's been some time since we introduced some of the primary players in these engagements, so I want to at least take some time to go over who we will be talking about when it comes to the Wheatfield. For the Confederates, we will be talking mostly about Lafayette McLaws's division of Longstreet's Corps. With his division will be brigades under William Barksdale, Joseph Kershaw, William Wofford, and Paul Sims. Barksdale, we know, will be charging the Peach Orchard with his Mississippi regiments. Kershaw, we will hopefully talk about in a future episode as being one of the more capable amateur generals of the war, here commanding South Carolina regiments. Kershaw was a lawyer before the war and would be a postmaster and state politician afterward. He has some capable regimental commanders, one in John Dobie Kennedy of the 2nd South Carolina, also a lawyer and future lieutenant governor of the state, as well as future House Representative Coolin David Wyatt Aiken of the 7th South Carolina. Sims was the brother of the seafarer and would be commanding Georgia regiments, Paul having acquired much in terms of military material before the war. He has a very capable subordinate who will go on to future commands in Colonel Good Bryan. Wofford would also command a brigade of Georgians, including Cobb's Legion and Phillips Legion, two of the more famous Georgian units during the war. Wofford was a lawyer before the war and will go on into Populist Party politics afterward. We do also need to point out that Tige Anderson and his Georgians will be in our story as well, and they will be part of Hood's division of Longstreet's Corps. Tige Anderson is in the thick of it in a lot of the major battles of the war, going on to be a police chief in Georgia after the conflict. On the Union side, we will of course have multiple players, but notably Caldwell's division of the 2nd Corps. Part of Regis de Trobriand's brigade would be initially in the field, the 110th Pennsylvania, 5th Michigan, and 17th Maine. Also involved around the Rose Farm early in the second day's action would be regiments under George Childs Burling. Burling was a coal merchant before the war from New Jersey, commanding for Gershom Mott, who was wounded and had not made it to Gettysburg. He was commanding the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th New Jersey, 2nd New Hampshire, and 115th Pennsylvania. Now, the reason why these regiments are going to be there initially is going to be that Sickles is going to famously have his recon of the far side of the Emmitsburg Road. Berdan sharpshooters and the 3rd Maine will run into Confederates who will confirm his suspicions that the rebels are there in force, So he will move the 2 divisions in his corps forward, occupying the peach orchard, forcing whatever plans Meade had to evolve now to respond to supporting Sickles, and hopefully staving off complete annihilation of the 3rd Corps. We will see some 5th Corps elements also arrive as well, so it's going to be a hodgepodge of different regiments. James Barnes is commanding a division that includes brigades under Strong Vincent, Jacob Schweitzer, and William Tilton. As we know famously, Strong Vincent is going to be diverted to Little Round Top. Barnes had previously been colonel of the 18th Massachusetts and had led them in the 7 days under Martindale. He had been elevated as a result of Meade and Sykes both moving up the ladder. A graduate of West Point in the same class as Lee, Barnes would go on to serve garrison duty post-Gettysburg. Tilton was a manufacturer and merchant before the war and had been captured at Gaines's Mill. He had actually been a major during that battle, taking over for the regiment's colonel as the line collapses. I know we're actually here at Gettysburg, but another episode that we have that is currently on the schedule and is in the slot, so to speak, here is the redo episode for Gaines's Mill. And a lot of the same 5th Corps regiments, especially that are here at the Battle of Gettysburg at the Wheatfield, are going to have participated at that battle. And I know that we are going backwards and having this battle first before we do that redo episode, but a lot of these individuals would have been junior officers and would have gained this valuable combat experience during the 7 days, and especially at a battle like that, to then get to this point, relatively almost exactly a year later, right? Tilton is going to command the 18th and 22nd Massachusetts, the 1st Michigan, and 118th Pennsylvania, the Corn Exchange Regiment. Colonel Jacob Schweitzer would command a brigade that included the 62nd Pennsylvania, the 4th Michigan, 9th Massachusetts, the Fighting 9th of mostly Irish, although they will be on picket duty and out of the action, and the 32nd Massachusetts. Schweitzer was a lawyer before the war and had also been captured at Gaines's Mill. His 62nd Pennsylvania heavily engaged in that battle as well. Caldwell has brigades under Edward Cross, who recently commanded the 5th New Hampshire, but also includes the 61st New York, 81st Pennsylvania, 148th Pennsylvania as well. The 61st was commanded by Oscar Brody, future Swedish Baptist missionary and former Swedish Navy man. Cross was an interesting character. He had spent some time in the West, bringing the war whoop with him into his service as a regimental commander. He would reportedly have a premonition of death before the battle, saying that it would be his last. Although there is a question as to whether he really meant that he was actually going to resign from the army. I have seen several contemporary sources that seem to lean toward the premonition of death side of things. Patrick Kelly, formerly of the 88th New York, commanded the famous Irish Brigade, much depleted in numbers. The 116th Pennsylvania in that brigade is commanded by St. Clair Mulholland, who had a Medal of Honor from Chancellorsville. Famously, they will receive absolution from Father Corby, standing on a rock prior to being deployed. Samuel Zook, a Mennonite from Pennsylvania, commanded the 52nd, 57th, 66th New York, and 140th Pennsylvania, the 52nd being mostly Germans from New York City. John R. Brooke from Pottstown, Pennsylvania, will go on to serve in the Spanish-American War and will command the 27th Connecticut, 2nd Delaware, 64th New York, 53rd, and 145th Pennsylvania. At this point in the war, Caldwell's division in the 2nd Corps might have been one of the more experienced outfits. 2nd Corps is usually tabbed as one of the better corps in the Army of the Potomac, and certainly this division might have been probably the most experienced troops that you could possibly have. And if you are having a crisis situation, then they might have been possibly the best troops to have on hand to respond to that crisis. So, right place, right time, certainly for the Union Army. I do want to also describe the Wheatfield and its location, or rather give you a description. One of the books, and one which I do really recommend if you're trying to just focus on the Wheatfield, is J. Jorgensen's Gettysburg's Bloody Wheatfield. And in the book, there is a good paragraph I want to read off because it gives a nice, concise description I could try to duplicate. However, I think is better just reading it off, and I want to give credit where credit is due. So here's the quote here. It is located north of Devil's Den and southeast of the Peach Orchard. The field is bordered on the southeast by Houck's Ridge and in the northwest by Stony Hill. The Wheatfield Road divided the northeastern portion of the Wheatfield from the southern edge of Trossel's Woods. A stone wall bordered the southern portion of the Wheatfield and Rose's Woods. A rail fence ran perpendicular from the right end of the stone wall and extended northwest toward Stony Hill. The ground to the northwest of the fence and wall was low, marshy, and covered by a growth of alders. The topography of the Wheatfield was such that the high ground was located at the northwest portion of the field, and the field sloped down to the stone wall. So, of course, once again, want to give a shout out to Jay Jorgensen and his description there. Again, could have tried to do my own description from various sources, but since he put it very nicely into the book there, decided just to go ahead and read off that quote. Famously, before the second day of action at Gettysburg, you have the reconnaissance of engineer Samuel Johnston. Now, Johnston, from Lee's staff we know, went somewhere on the southern end of the battlefield, but where he went to is actually kind of hard to say. There are those who pointed out that if he went to where he thought he did, then he would have run into some kind of federal presence. So it's hard to imagine that he actually went there, though. But this is going to be the basis of the attack plan on July 2nd. Lee will meet with his fellow officers, including Longstreet, Hood, and Heath, recovering from the shot he had taken in the head the previous day. Longstreet will briefly argue against trying to fight things out, which is going to lead to all of the arguments of how he's jealous of Jackson and how at Gettysburg he phones it in, etc., etc., but he will begin to deploy his troops. Unfortunately, though, George and Lafayette McLaws, leading a lot of our main characters on the gray side today, will be marching on a route led by Johnson that will snake around coming to a rise that will then be in view of Little Round Top, which now has a Union signal station on it. This is, of course, an issue for McLaws and Longstreet, and so there will be a countermarch, adding 2 hours to the deployment and time for the attack. Edward Porter Alexander will argue that he had found a shorter route and had informed the officers that they could just take that way, in which the artillery had traveled, but they would decline for whatever reason, again adding to the rumors that Longstreet was sabotaging the plan because he didn't really want to go through with it. I will say that, whatever the reasons, this and Knoxville is going to be the deteriorating of the relationship between Longstreet and McLaws, so there is that. Now, Longstreet, of course, famously wants to do what Lee had said that they were going to do. They were going to find their ground that was going to be advantageous for them. They were going to force me to attack them. So he is really sticking to that, and he knows that the previous day there had been an encounter battle. They had acted offensively, and it had gone well for the Confederates, but continuing to have this offensive battle on the second day, he's not so sure that they want to continue doing that. So we know that Longstreet is just thinking of things in that lens, because that's how they had kind of talked it. It's like, we're not going to according to the game plan, right? And now, is that necessarily him kind of phoning things in or being a malcontent? I don't necessarily think so. The attacks will famously jump off, of course, later in the afternoon. We know how much time works in the Civil War, though, and how everything is a little off when it comes to time because everyone has a different watch. Hood is going to be wounded via artillery fairly early in the assault, and so operational control is going to fall to Evander Law. But with that, there is going to be a lack of operational control just in general. So Polly Robertson's brigade of Texans is going to veer off toward Little Round Top. It will be the honorary Texans that will slightly veer off in our story, the 3rd Arkansas, and they will engage Federals on Houck's Ridge, the lower portion of the Wheatfield in the woods and rocky terrain. This will be some tough fighting, and Van Manning, colonel of the 3rd, will wish for some support. Tig Anderson and his Georgians would be moving toward the Rose Farm complex, so they would be arriving to provide some help. Facing them on the edge of the Wheatfield would be this conglomeration of 3rd Corps troops. It really is interesting to me just how mixed up some of these men are going to be. They are partially Regis de Trobriand's men, but also partly Burling's brigades, as well as part of Humphreys, mostly around Stony Hill in the rear of the Rose Farm area toward the Wheatfield Road, able to provide support for the peach orchard. Tig Anderson's men would receive fairly heavy fire as they advanced into the Rose Farm woods, as one member of the 8th Georgia would write. Our lines did not waver under the galling musketry, but came on almost at a run, firing vigorously. I have never read in military history of any soldiers who could deliver such deadly volleys as ours when charging. We were soon ranged along our side of the bog. The fire upon us slackened, and I saw that ours had been very destructive, and that the men in our front were thinking more of shelter by the rocks and trees than of firing. Advancing through some marshy terrain caused by Plum Run, the Georgians would make contact with some of Burnling's regiments, forcing casualties and the retiring of the 8th New Jersey and the 115th Pennsylvania. The 17th Maine had taken up a position along the stone wall at the edge of the field and refused part of its line as a gap was forming there. Captain George Winslow's 1st New York Light Artillery had deployed in the Wheatfield itself to give us an idea of additional support. Timeliness I have seen as being all over the place, but generally speaking, I think the 3rd Corps was seen to have been needing support fairly early, so Tilton and Schweitzer's arrival may have been fairly early on in the Stony Hill Rose Farm vicinity. Obviously, there is always a kind of debate as to when things happen. As we mentioned, time is always kind of a problem when it comes to the Civil War. Famously, I think we are still not really sure of what happens first. Does Willard's Harper's Ferry cowards begin their attack first, or does the 1st Minnesota? What time is it all collapsing? What time is everything scrambling? What time does Sickles get wounded? Hard to say. Some regiments even claim that other regiments aren't even there. So it is kind of hard to say. Were they there and they just missed each other, or were they actually telling the truth and they weren't there? So that's kind of always sort of a debate. Tig Anderson would wish to renew his attacks after a brief lull, but he would do so supported by Kershaw. Kershaw, in turn, would be supported by Barksdale and his Mississippi regiments, as they pushed off toward the peach orchard. But Barksdale had to get through artillery, so he would be delayed, Kershaw advancing first. His regiments famously would be veering toward the Rose Farm and hitting artillery beyond. We have an account from the 2nd South Carolina. Just as our left struck the depression in the ground, every Federal cannon let fly at us with grape. Oh, the awful, deathly, surging sounds of those little black balls as they flew by us, through us, between our legs, and over us. Many, of course, were struck down, including Captain Pulliam, who was instantly killed. Then the order was given to double quick, and we were mad and fully determined to take and silence those batteries at once. We had gotten onto the level land. The Federal guns were the next fusillade of grape met us. One of the little black balls passed between my legs. We were now so close to the Federal gunners that they seemed bewildered, and were apparently trying to get their guns to the rear. Famously, though, we have the confused order as the regiments approached Bigelow's Massachusetts battery to dress right, allowing for the continual raking of the South Carolina troops. We have an account of this as well. Supposing that the orders came from General Kershaw, I afterwards learned that it did not. The consequences were fatal. We were, in 10 minutes or less, terribly butchered. A body of infantry to our left opened on us, and as a volley of grape would strike our line, I saw half a dozen at a time knocked up and flung to the ground like trifles. In about a short space of time, we had about half of our men killed or wounded. It was the most shocking battle I've ever witnessed. There were familiar forms and faces, with parts of their heads shot away, legs shattered, arms torn off. Part of the confusion is going to be that the pressure at the Wheatfield had pulled some of the regiments on Stony Hill, creating a gap that could potentially be exploited. However, the most immediate and pressing concern for the South Carolina troops probably should have been the artillery to their front, who, when they wheeled right, at close range could continue to pound them with canister. While this affected many of the regiments in Kershaw's command, some, like the 15th, could be utilized to also pressure Stony Hill at Anderson's request. Tilton on Stony Hill would see the South Carolina troops around the Rose Farm, overlapping his position, and despite him being in a solid spot for defense, he would think this untenable. Now, he was not aware of this disastrous order that was seeing massive casualties amongst the Palmetto Staters, but you can see the logic behind his decision. Although you probably could have hoped that Barnes would have intervened instead of authorizing him to make the call, but this is more my opinion on the matter. He would begin to pull back the regiments toward the Trossel Woods beyond the Wheatfield Road. In Schweitzer's brigade, William Prescott of the 32nd Massachusetts would balk at the order to withdraw. He would state that he did not want to, and that he could hold the place, but withdraw they would. Other regiments would join them in announcing their displeasure. David Birney would actually personally rally the 17th Maine as they were grouped at Winslow's Battery, along with the 5th Michigan, then marching back to confront Anderson's Georgians as they emerged from the woods. The Bay Staters would trade shots in the open with the rebels before being forced to retire, taking fire from them and the South Carolina troops moving on to Stony Hill. Arriving onto the scene would then be Caldwell and his 2nd Corps Division. These troops had been in reserve on Cemetery Ridge and had witnessed Sickles and his corps advancing to their positions around the peach orchard. As these were veteran troops, as we have mentioned, they had stopped what they were doing, realizing something was about to happen. This is always one of those moments, too, that you can kind of point to where is this just hindsight, perhaps, that these guys are talking about it afterwards? Or how does Dan Sickles not see this? Or, I don't know. It's just one of those things where well, if this was such a bad position to be in, and even the rank and file that's on Cemetery Ridge realizes, oh man, he's in such a bad spot that for sure it's about to be exploited by the Confederate Army. Again, is this hindsight? Is it one of these things where it just makes a good story? Who knows, right? Caldwell's lead brigade was his former command, led by Cross, followed by Kelly's Irish, and then Brooke. Cross would advance into the Wheatfield first, his regiment skirting the edge, actually the 5th New Hampshire in the woods. Tige Anderson's Georgians would have a strong position on the far side of the field, as attested to by the casualties suffered by the 17th Maine, filtering out as the 2nd Corps troops came in. A member of this brigade would write, as we emerged from the woods into the open ground, the bullets from the enemy skirmishers came buzzing around like bees, and we could see the puffs of smoke from their rifles in every direction, showing that we were about to encounter a heavy force. Casualties would mount in front and then on flank. Cross would wish to see the situation in the woods. Major Hale writing of the last time he saw his commander. Strode alone into the woods, where the right wing of the 148th Pennsylvania and 5th New Hampshire, to judge by the sound, were tearing things all to pieces. Standing by my prisoners, I looked after him, sort of regretfully, as he vanished amongst the trees. It would be in the trees where Cross is hit in the stomach and mortally wounded during the action. Henry Boyd McKean of the 81st Pennsylvania would take over. A Princeton graduate, the brigade would go to ground under fire for the time being. The Irish would move into the field, Brooks' brigade following. Zook was pulled by a staff officer from Sickles, who would task his brigade to assist in the Stony Hill area. The Mennonite general would at first balk, saying his orders were to advance with the column, but eventually would state, "Sir, if you will give me the order of General Sickles, I will obey it." Zook's regiments would advance from the Wheatfield Road, relatively assaulting toward Stony Hill. They would advance over Schweitzer's men, who humorously called out, "Don't mind us, step anywhere, step on us." Notably, Zook has the 140th Pennsylvania, mostly Western Pennsylvania recruited, but obviously many Pennsylvania regiments feel strongly about defending their home state. The fighting would grow fierce in this area, the South Carolina troops in a good defensive position, A Union soldier remembers. The firing became terrific, and the slaughter frightful. We were enveloped in smoke and fire, not only in front, but on the left, and even at times on our right, apparently from men posted on the mountainsides. Men fire promiscuously, steadily pressing forward, but the fighting was so mixed, and the rebel and Union lines so close together, and in some places intermingled, that a clear idea of what was going on was not readily attainable. Zook would be mortally wounded as his brigade drove into the enemy, a round glancing off a rock and hitting him in the stomach, lodging in his spine. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Freudenberg of the 52nd New York and Colonel Richard Roberts of 140th New York would also go down in the fierce fighting for Stony Hill. With Zook's brigade fighting the 2nd, 3rd, and 7th South Carolina, the Irish would come to their assistance, advancing through the Wheatfield. They would wheel and come in on Stony Hill from the flank, Kershaw refusing his line. A fellow officer would remark to Colonel Aiken, "Is that not a magnificent sight?" as he pointed to the line of gaily dressed Union forces in the Wheatfield, whose almost perfect line was preserved, though inflated by our fire from the woods, decimating the front line, whose gaps of death were prominently filled by each file closer stepping to the front as his file leader fell. As they approached, Kershaw had gone for help, trying to get Semmes and his Georgians to fill in any gaps between him and Tige Anderson's Georgians. So hopefully I have some maps here to go along with what's going on, but to just give you an idea, if we're looking at the Wheatfield in the middle, right, and the Confederates are on the left, they're coming from left to right, and we already had kind of on the left-hand portion of the Wheatfield, that's kind of where you had your initial third corps setup. They've already been kind of driven out. You had Caldwell's command that came down from the right-hand corner of our square. We'll have a rectangle square for the Wheatfield. The very top portion in the middle of our rectangle here is going to be Stony Hill. And so you had Cross's brigade that comes down, and they are swinging directly into the Wheatfield. Then you have the Irish that are going to follow them. They're going to kind of be behind them. And then you're going to have Zook's brigade that comes down, and they're going to immediately kind of turn into Stony Hill. And then, of course, you have the South Carolinians who are occupying Stony Hill, and Tige Anderson's Georgians are then kind of on the left-hand side of your Wheatfield. And you have the Irish who were in the Wheatfield, and they have turned and are moving up into Stony Hill. So that's kind of, if you think about it like that, hopefully that's a good description of it. And again, hopefully I'll also include maps that will make things clear. But I think that part of the allure of the Wheatfield is that it is kind of confusing. And if you can understand how the flow of things goes, it makes it that much more interesting. At this point in the fighting, Anderson had gone down wounded, and Semmes was mortally wounded, hit in the femoral artery, getting his troops into the Rose Farm area. The 50th Georgia would be on hand relatively in the area of the Wheatfield. Kelly's Irish would assault the rebels as they sheltered amongst the rocks on Stony Hill for protection, but Kershaw was driven out by the pressure of the two brigades. The Irish original regiments of the 69th, 63rd, 88th were consolidated into a single entity, at this point company-sized units, almost with the 28th Massachusetts and 116th Pennsylvania supporting, but not much larger. The 88th, with 90 men, is the biggest outfit. Amazingly, there is only some 381 men in the entire brigade. The 63rd New York was still armed with smoothbore buck and ball weapons, so getting close was preferable, and they would get close to within 15 yards of the Palmetto Staters. A member of the 28th Massachusetts would write home that it was a hot place, and the little brigade fought like heroes. As we can imagine, the men under Kershaw were probably very well spent at this point, even if in real time they had actually not been engaged all that long. Low on ammunition, and outflanked by the two Union brigades, however, would see Stony Hill back in Federal hands, although at a high price. Sinclair Mulholland would write of the carnage on the battlefield. One young boy lay outstretched on a large rock, with his musket still grasped in his hand, his pale, calm face upturned to the sunny sky, the warm blood still flowing from the hole in his forehead, and running in a red stream over the gray stone. The young hero had just given his life for his country. A sweet, childish face it was, lips parted in a smile, those still lips on which the mother's kisses had slightly fallen, warm and tender. The writer gazed upon the relics of a saint, but the little boy lying there with his blood coloring the soil of his own state, and his young heart, stilled forever, seemed more like an angel than any of the others. Brooks' brigade would be the last into the Wheatfield from Caldwell, and he would advance past the rest and into the stone wall on the far end, driving away the remnants of Anderson's Georgians. We have an account from a member of Anderson's brigade. Just then, this color bearer stepped back into his line, and we knew that the volley was coming. With the precision of a dress parade, the magnificent line of Federals lowered their pieces, and the volley came. We had time to duck our heads, and the sheet of lead passed harmlessly over us, but I could see where the bullets cut and plowed the ground behind us. Every man in us then seemed to realize our tremendous advantage. I rose up, looked along our line, and I thought then, and think yet, that the volley had passed entirely harmlessly over our heads, but that by it we did not lose our man. Our men rested their guns on the grass in front, and with the solid line of the enemy in easy close range returned the fire. It seemed that not a bullet went above their heads or below their feet. They fell right and left. There was a space below the smoke of a few inches just above the ground, and we in our rifle pit, having our eyes nearly on the level of the ground, could just see below the smoke the line of their feet. This line rapidly thinned. There was a long blue line on the ground, so close together that anyone could have walked over them as far as their front extended without touching the earth. In fact, he would have the most success in clearing the field for the Union troops. Not only would Brooke brush back the rebels, but he would advance out of the wheat, past the marshy ground beyond and engage Sims' regiments as they had a strong position. But Brooke advanced, and he would see too much success, receiving inflating fire from the 1st Texas and 15th Georgia from Devil's Den, 2 of Cross's regiments trying to assist. But the pause of Kelly and Zook would leave that flank exposed, allowing for heavy fire. Brooke, in fact, would be wounded as he called for more ammunition and reinforcements from Caldwell. The situation on the ground, though, was about to drastically change for the Union troops. William Wofford's brigade of Georgians, the last of McCaw's division, had been following Barksdale, but by this point in the fighting, the Peach Orchard was empty, and Barksdale, Mississippi boys were turning up Cemetery Ridge, conforming probably with Wilcox, and Hancock is scrambling with artillery on the Plum Run line, and then Willard and the 1st Minnesota, of course, as already mentioned. Well, Wofford would surmise he would be better used in turning in the opposite direction, so he would be moving down the Wheatfield Road, coming to the aid of Kershaw and his men as they were dislodged from Stony Hill. Wofford's Georgians were too much for Zook and Kelly, who would begin flight from their position with many captured. A famous incident would then occur between Caldwell and a staff officer. "General, you had better look out. The line in front is giving way." General Caldwell, who was in conversation with General Ayres, turned and said, in a rather sharp manner, "That's not so, sir. Those are my troops being relieved." In a few moments, again said, "General Ayres, you have to look out for your command. I don't care what anyone says, those troops in front are running away." At this, both generals scanned the battlefield. General Caldwell put spurs to his horse and rode off to the right, along the stone wall. A Georgian would ride of the close quarter assault. We went into them with our bayonets, and clubbed them with our guns. It was here that I went after the flag, and after shooting one man and clubbing 5 others, I was in the act of reaching for the flag when a fellow named Smith jumped in ahead of me and grabbed it. I came very near to clubbing him, but he put up such a pitiful mouth about having a family of small children that he wanted to see so bad. I let him have it, so he could get a furlough. Jacob Schweitzer at this time had been thrown into the Wheatfield, moving toward the stone wall on the far end. Now, at the time, he was probably correct in thinking that he was going to help Brooke, and had Wofford not been there, he would have been in a good position to be moving toward that goal. But Wofford's command had been moving down south into Stony Hill from the front. So remember again, we have our rectangle. At the very top of our rectangle, in the middle of that line, is Stony Hill. Well, Wofford's command is actually moving down, straight down, into Stony Hill, so they're going to start taking fire from that direction. This, of course, is going to prompt the famous line from the color bearer of Schweitzer: "I'll be damned, Colonel, but I think we're facing the wrong way." Schweitzer would try to meet this threat, the remnants of Caldwell's division passing through him, escaping through the field. Brooke will in fact withdraw just in time, as he might have been fully cut off. The 4th Michigan and 62nd Pennsylvania would turn for a brief moment, stand in the field, the brigade trying to move diagonally out of their predicament. Unfortunately, an order in error got the 32nd Massachusetts to fully withdraw, which could have proven a full disaster, the brigade surrounded. As it was, the Union troops were in a tight spot, the Confederates converging on their position. Harrison Jeffords, colonel of the 4th Michigan, would be bayoneted attempting to save his regimental colors, as they had been dropped in this part of the action. The Union fugitives would break for the safety of Roman Ayres and his 2 brigades of regulars, commanded by Sidney Burbank and Hannibal Day. The regulars would have a tough time in the Wheatfield, being hit from several sides. It was not long before they were forced to retire from the Wheat and toward the base of Little Round Top. Conducting a fighting withdrawal, they would at times stop and turn and give a volley at the Russian Confederates. This, of course, is where we get the quote of how the regulars showed us how to march like soldiers, but at Wheatfield, they showed us how to die like soldiers. The rebels were a conglomeration of all brigades: Kershaw, Sims, Anderson, and Wofford, as well as Rock Benning's Georgians, and maybe even some remnants of Hood's Texans. We have an account of the retreat into Plum Run Valley from a regular. The few hundred yards to the foot of Little Round Top, already strewn with our disabled comrades, became a very charnel house, and every step was marked by ghostly lines of dead and wounded. Our merciless foes, from their vantage ground, on our now right, poured in volley after volley. Their battalions poured in a deadly fire on our flank until, gasping and bleeding, we reached Little Round Top and took position behind Hazlett's guns. Near the base of Little Round Top, though, would form the final division of the 5th Corps, Samuel Crawford's Pennsylvania Reserves, and Frank Wienen's 6th Corps Brigade. This defense line would stop the rebels, some of whom would retire on their own accord, but some were ordered by Longstreet to pause. Wofford's Georgians were some of the men who were perturbed at the concept of not continuing. Here we have yet another accusation against Longstreet. But the carnage had already been high, and the rebels were satisfied in returning to Stony Hill and the Rosewoods as July 2nd comes to a close. In all, 7,500 Confederates and 12,700 Union troops had fought in and around the Wheatfield. This is a sort of battle in and of itself, but casualty figures are staggering, with Confederates seeing a 32% rate and Union troops seeing a 29% rate. In particular to note, Brooks' brigade seeing a staggering 45% casualty rate in their drive of the rebels. But what exactly is the significance of this portion of the battle? Well, it is certainly part of what I would consider to be the most pivotal of the 3 days, so there is that, but we can apply that to pretty much anywhere on the field. I think the significance really lies in the missed opportunity, mostly on the southern side, and obviously the patchwork nature of the defense that leads to Pickett's charge on the 3rd day for the Union side. On the latter, this is one of the easier things to see because it is a tangible result. The line doesn't break. There is still one defensive structure. Fairly straightforward. I'd probably argue that the Wheatfield, as opposed to the other locations on the southern end, Devil's Den, Little Round Top, is the most critical location for a breakthrough. Although if you throw Sherfy's Peach Orchard in, maybe not. What happens if the Confederates fully push through the Wheatfield? It's hard to kind of say, right? You'd still have Crawford's division, you'd still have part of this 6th Corps command. Missed opportunity lies on the Confederate side in the execution of the assault. Notably, I think the Wheatfield is also important because if that action is not happening, then what does Wofford's brigade do? Are they better used moving in behind Barksdale? I think that this is probably the case, although he is very helpful toward Kershaw and Tige Anderson, and all the other brigades that are down here in this section of the field. And he's helpful in terms of stabilizing things for the Confederates, right? But if you are thinking about what is the overall outcome of the battle and what could have really tipped the scales, is Wofford's brigade moving up and into and along Cemetery Ridge and eliminating that section of the field for the Confederates on the second day, as opposed to them having to assault it on the third day? Is that more significant than what he ends up doing? I don't know. I would say that things would have been very different, and maybe that even if he does turn and move up the ridge, maybe if he's trying to combine with Rand's Right's Georgians, who are also going to be assaulting Cemetery Ridge and they're going to fail on the second day, maybe things still work out the way that they do, and maybe there's still a Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble charge on the third day, right? But maybe not. Maybe we take that piece off of the table for the Union Army, and Lee has to come up with something else for the third day. And I'm sure that when you first started listening to this episode, many of you probably didn't think that I was specifically going to cite William Wofford's brigade and really highlight that as being maybe the most significant part of the Wheatfield, but it might actually be. The fact, though, that there's enough Union activity to pull his attention, the fact that Caldwell arrives and he is able to be in a position to take Wofford away from turning up the field, though, there's something to be said for that as well. So we do have that for a check mark in the Union direction. So we can also maybe point to that as being significant. So maybe it's not just William Wofford's brigade. So we can probably also cite Caldwell here, and maybe even some of these other Fifth Corps elements as well that end up being there toward the end of the action on the Wheatfield. So let's pause there. I think I'm satisfied with having gone back and really redone the Wheatfield. Now, it is a piece of the overall puzzle, so you can't really tell the story of the Wheatfield without mentioning some of the other actions and locations, but in really honing in and understanding the action, I think we have done a better job of doing that today. Next time, we stick with Gettysburg, we have a different type of episode, and we're doing something that I've alluded to several times before. We need to talk about who the savior for the Union is. We're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of that and run down all the possible candidates. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.